but she had to keep going, and I'm afraid I bellowed at her. How dare you try and whip me in this way? My closest friend won't speak to me anymore, a Northern Irish guy outside Parliament, and I miss him desperately. So I've rebelled a lot, but on 3 key issues, maybe on HS2 as well, and maybe also on freedom to protest. But, they were not scattergun issues. They were all issues.
Hello and welcome to Coffee House Shots. I'm James Heale and I'm joined today by Steve Baker, the former Conservative MP and serial rebel. And Steve, thanks for joining us today. We're talking really in this week about the Great Labour Welfare Rebellion. Yeah. And you, of course, made rebellion something of a habit during your 14 years. Tell us about your first rebellion as a Conservative MP at the beginning of that coalition government. Well,
I like to think that my rebellion habit was on a limited range of issues, yes, and that I was understood to just have strong views on those issues. It wasn't like scattergun. My first rebellion was following the paleo-sceptics, and they wouldn't mind me calling them that, the long-term Eurosceptics, in some hopeless EU-related rebellion. And it was very strange because I was very, very nervous. And I got a call to go and see Patrick McLaughlin, the Chief Whip. So I go in there as a brand new MP, and I'm sitting there, and I'm obviously terrified, and he's sitting there, and of course he's a big man, and he's got his bullwhip up on the wall behind him, and I am so nervous, and it becomes clear he's obviously only just invited me in to get to know me because he's never met me before. Whereas I'm terrified, I'm about to tell him I'm rebelling. Eventually we get round to it, and I say, well, because he asks me for loyalty always. I said, well, about that, Chief, I'll be rebelling later against the government. He practically exploded. And I remember saying something like, the truth is I came here to get a referendum on the EU, preferably get us out, something like that. And I'd vote against the government if you were standing at the exit from the lobby with the no lobby with a machine gun. And that was...
Wow.
Yeah. So, but I'd spoken to Douglas Carswell, who looked bewildered when I asked this question. But I said, how do you rebel? What do you do? And he looked completely backwinded that I'd asked at all. But then he said to me, the crucial point is make your mind up and then do it, but never fold. Once you've folded once, they'll always know that you will fold under pressure. So don't do that. Decide, do, don't waver. And that's partly why I was so firm with Patrick.
And how did you become sort of the Brexit organiser of the rebellions? What was your sort of role, your journey from that sort of first vote, going in to tell Patrick McLaughlin, to then during the Brexit years becoming the sort of Brexit hard man who was organising the ERG?
My worst mistake, the Brexit hard man thing. What happened was that there was a group that met in Room R, really hardline rebels, so Carswell, Chope, Nuttall, Reckless, and they met very, very secretly and arranged various rebellions, and they were arranging the rebellion of 81 led by David Nuttall, which forced David Cameron to promise a referendum, and I had been invited to go to that meeting, and Douglas appointed me the whip for that vote. And so that was the beginning of the genesis, Douglas appointing me to organise that vote, basically to their specification. We agreed the line to take in that room. David had the speech, and it was for me to encourage as many colleagues as possible. And I'll never forget David Cameron looking at me like absolute thunder. I can close my eyes and still see the video play through my mind. And it's more than a decade ago. But he absolutely stalked into the Commons, glaring at us in the lobby as I was standing at the door encouraging colleagues in. He was extremely displeased.
And of course, in the actual whip's office, there's this whole culture of you come in as an assistant whip, you become a full whip, you become a deputy chief whip, you become a chief whip. How does it work for rebellion? And presumably you get sort of forged by experience and adversity, and you sort of know the kind of awkward squad, as it were, who sort of become your flock.
Well, yeah, so I never kind of aspired to be the whip for the awkward squad. I think the thing to remember is that members of Parliament get themselves elected to have influence. Nobody gets into Parliament because they'd like to be just lobby fodder.
Yeah.
It's quite a lot of trouble to become a member of Parliament, and it's, if I say so myself, a quite noble but quite burdensome task to represent 75,000 people, 2/3 of whom didn't want you to do the job. So they don't do it for no reason. They do it to get influence. So the trick, if you're organising in rebellion against the government, you're not doing it for a laugh. I mean, I must say, every rebellion I've had, I really wished I wasn't there. It would have been lovely if the government had been doing what I'd wanted in the first place. But you're doing it by giving MPs what they want. So through COVID, I was the organiser of the whip for a different group of MPs. They, quite a lot of the people who were rebelling over COVID restrictions.
This is Plan B, wasn't it? December 2021?
Oh gosh, you take me back now. But it's weird. I was so accustomed then to organising rebellion that a lot of it was just like money for old rope, as it were, to just... There was no money involved. But the point is that during COVID, the subset of members of Parliament who were interested in rebelling included a lot of Remainers. It was not the usual suspects. So really, when you're a rebel organiser, you're trying to give members of Parliament what they want. There's no patronage, of course. There's no hierarchy. But they were turning to me. I remember vividly when they turned to me in Committee Room 14 over COVID. Graham Brady and I had eventually said we must have a protest about the Coronavirus Act being renewed. And after we'd had that protest, and I was exhausted, by the way, I remember we had a meeting in room 14 and colleagues said to me, Steve, we need you to organise something. So, what do you do? If colleagues are turning to you saying, we would like you to organise, lead us, well... I remember the feeling, I was sort of smiling because I was kind of relishing the idea of being busy in that way and serving them in that way, but also there's a kind of horror that here we go again.
And there was some talk this week that the welfare rebellion was sort of not done over WhatsApp. It was done, from what we can tell, the ringleaders went to the MPs, they then wrote it down that they were going to sign a rebel amendment, and it wasn't until the sort of first initial list was published on Monday evening that this great flurry, like the Viet Cong, of 108 names comes forward. Was that sort of the similar style you had in terms of trying to make sure the government didn't find out how big a rebellion was?
Absolutely. It always begins with the personal touch, the personal contact, the personal conversation. You can't just WhatsApp a colleague and say, hey, you're going to vote no against the government with me later. That doesn't work. It always begins with a personal touch. So, Mark Francois and I would organise. He actually was in charge of the ERG's buddies while I was deputy chairman, but typically I operated electronically and he operated the traditional way. But the traditional way is how you get MPs first to agree to come with you. And you can't do that electronically. It's only once that they're cohered together as a team who want to know what we are doing, and then you can WhatsApp them. So in a sense, people have confused at which point of the playbook these Labour rebels are in. They're at the beginning of the playbook, and they've, of course, they've done things the old-fashioned way and kept it secret till the last moment because they needed to prevent the absolutely ruthless and effective Labour Whip's office from peeling people off. And if I may say so, by the way, they have been ruthless because they took the whip off Labour MPs just for ordinary policy votes in order to say to everyone, we are not having that. And then, but what's it done? It's raised the stakes. So they made a rod for their own back, the Labour whips, because they forced those Labour rebels to show a devastating number. So they've emerged now. They couldn't emerge and show 5 or 10 or 12 because they'd have had the whip taken off them. But if you emerge and you show 123, well, there's no way the government falls. So they knew what they were doing, but that means they've had to deliver a devastating blow to their own government from the start.
That's a really interesting point. Yes, that first rebellion was sort of July 2024, two-child benefit cap. As you say, it was such a minority that they could strip it and they could give it back to some. But when you have something 10 times bigger than that, there's absolutely no way you could do that.
No, absolutely. The government would have fallen if they had, well, technically fallen. They would if they'd taken the whip off them. And those rebels knew that. So they've emerged out of nothing with this huge thing. And they've done what, the old one too. Here's a huge number. Oh, no, look, it's growing.
Yeah.
And because, of course, then you're into... Because politics is war minus the shooting. You're then into demoralising your opponent. Now for the rebels, their own whip's office is the opponent, and they need to demoralise them. So they showed a big number and then grew it.
And the crazy thing, of course, was that the government kept amping up the stakes. And so if you saw Keir Starmer's comments at that NATO press conference, 2:45 on Wednesday, he was saying it was sort of noises off. You think, hang on a second.
Noises.
And then 6 more signed it, and then it's 128 at that point.
It's been really fascinating to watch the catalogue of mistakes being made.
Right.
To try and just suppress MPs for having legitimate points of view. I might disagree with them. Very, very clear government spending needs to be cut. But they've got legitimate points of view, certainly within their tradition. You can't just suppress them and expect them to do nothing. Using excessive force, calling them noises off. A Prime Minister, once again, not being there to hear their members of Parliament. Now, of course, I've never been a Prime Minister. I don't know the stresses. But it seems unlikely. But of course, the Prime Minister is under immense and impossible pressure, but they always seem to forget that their power comes to them from the public via members of the House of Commons. And unless they keep those members of the House of Commons on board, not just by FaceTime, but by actually engaging with them, they will lose their influence with those members of Parliament and they will suffer rebellions and they will in the end be removed.
Yes, you mentioned a playbook. How does this playbook unfold?
Well, I mean, it starts with discontent.
Yep.
It starts with discontent in numbers. And a big mistake, of course, is to do something which is squarely cutting across your own tradition. So in this case, cutting welfare. I mean, the Labour Party has got itself into a position of bombs, not benefits. Well, for those of us who had the misery of the 2010 Parliament, when we were doing austerity, and we heard what Labour MPs were saying to us about how we were cruel and we were going to be killing people, it was miserable. Rachel Reeves was one of those making it miserable. Well, then they do a complete volte-face and tell their own people they're going to be cutting personal independence payment for disabled people, and then expect just automatic loyalty. It's a terrible, crass, complacent mistake. Why would they make a mistake like that? I'm afraid here's the problem. God bless the civil service, but they explicitly do not do politics.
Yes, yeah.
They're quite good at parliamentary handling, which of course isn't party political. It's about the whole of Parliament. But what happens, I think, is ministers get cosseted in their private offices and with officials who don't do party politics, don't do parliamentary politics in the ordinary run of things. And I think ministers and prime ministers just forget you can't take your members of Parliament for granted.
Absolutely not. And I think that 2 points, one of which is the misremembering of the 2010s history is fascinating, given that so many of the people involved, like Rachel Reeves, saw it firsthand. And there was an interview she did, I think it was the New Statesman a few years ago, where she was almost on the verge of tears talking about what happened there. Then to press ahead with this sort of clearly not particularly well thought through series of reforms, which were done more for Treasury, I would call it abacus economics, where we'll just take a bit of money there and move it there, wasn't going to work. And the second point, as you say, Steve, is just how lacking an understanding of the parliamentary party in post-2024 this was, because these people who made their name and cut their teeth politically during that austerity period.
Isn't it? So it's revealed so many things. One, the facts of life are conservative, and the facts of life have caught up with this Labour government. Age-related spending means that for the rest of our lives, the fiscal position is going to be extremely difficult. The other thing that's caught up with them is that once you're in there, once you're actually having to take the decisions, you find yourself adopting policies which you don't then think through politically. So, for example, taking away winter fuel allowance from better-off pensioners. They must have thought about it briefly politically, and they must have thought they'd get away with it because pensioners vote Conservative. But that was just so obviously an official guided policy. And it's very revealing to me. It came out while we were in a leadership contest, and we ended up opposing it. You can see why we'd oppose it if we weren't really thinking it through with proper leadership. Well, because pensioners vote Conservative. But unfortunately, here's the problem. In the medium to long run, we're going to go bankrupt because of age-related spending. It's in the OBRs, the Office for Budget Responsibility figures. Spending soaring away, revenues stagnating. That gap means we'll be ruined. We are going to have to reduce age-related spending. If we can't even manage to take winter fuel payment off better-off pensioners, we are ruined. So it was actually a good policy, badly landed, and we should have been able to reluctantly support it. We might have asked, the way it should have been done was, we're going to increase the amount of support for genuinely poor pensioners because we should be welfare maximising. This is a government, our government or theirs, this is a government which looks after those genuinely in need. And if you're a pensioner with no other means of support, we cannot leave you in a position with no choice but heating or eating. And so therefore we are going to increase the support for less well-off pensioners. We're going to pay for it by taking winter fuel allowance off better-off pensioners who just don't need it, who give it to charity or spend it on a good bottle of whiskey, as people have said to me. Now that policy we would have all supported.
Yes.
But I think what she did was she took a policy given to her quite reasonably by officials, didn't put the political gloss around it, and we have, on the centre-right, because reform was bad, we've now put ourselves in a position where we can't even manage to back the most moderate cut to age-related spending. And even worse, we're celebrating that the government had to do a U-turn. And I look at the fiscal projections and I despair of that.
I think, is there any difference in terms of what Labour and Conservative MPs, their rebellions are like? I mean, obviously there are certain issues that matter more. So Europe was always a huge Tory fault line for decades, even through the 60s and 70s. And Labour, obviously, welfare is something that's hugely important to that party. In terms of, how the parties operate into rebellion, are all the tactics and strategy the same, or do you see differences in the two sides?
Well, I think that the Labour Party has put it off a lot longer.
Yeah.
I think we were much more willing to rebel early. I mean, that first Patrick McLaughton conversation was very early after my first election. Because I'd got in to try and make the point that the European Union was no longer legitimate. I mean, I'd gone from being a European federalist to being pro-leave. And I wanted to take the nation on that journey, very naively. But what I think Labour have done is put that moment, that dread moment, off. I think they've been extremely optimistic with this enormous victory they had. I think that the Labour whips and the Labour machine has gone to great lengths to keep Labour members occupied. So backbench members have been working on regulatory reform, for example. I ran into a Labour MP who was talking about how to reform the CAA. I thought, well, we might have done that. But so they've tried to keep them busy, tried to keep them off rebellion, tried to make them feel that they matter. And so I think that what Labour have done is be much more inherently loyal. I think the problem, again, what's been really different here, is that the Labour machines kind of shoved them over the ledge. They've marched them up the hill and then said, you will vote to take away disability benefits. And by the way, we're threatening loss of the whip. And that was just bound to create an enormous conflagration.
Absolutely. And in terms of how you would give any advice to Labour rebels listening to this podcast, what are the sort of best ways to keep your troops in line, expand your numbers, etc., and ensure that you're trusted as a sort of honest broker leading a rebellion?
Well, I'm still a Conservative partisan,
Yes.
so it's tempting to give partisan advice, but I'll give honest advice. The honest advice is you should decide what you're trying to do. What we were trying to do with the European Union was illustrate to the public the problems of the European Union and why in due course it would be a good idea to vote to leave. With COVID, we were trying to illustrate that children, for example, would suffer terribly by being shut out of school. I think that's now unarguable. And so on. We were really, cost of net zero, we were trying to be very clear that net zero was disproportionate and had costs we couldn't bear. And again, I think we've won that argument. So we were very clear what our aim was. And this comes from, I'm afraid, my military training, although I was an engineer, not an operational person. But selection and maintenance of the aim. Because von Clausewitz said, war is a continuation of politics by other means. Well, turn that on its head. Politics really is war minus the shooting. It's visceral. And when it gets visceral and all the loyalty starts coming in, it's a horrible place to be, the rebel lobby, with some people of another party goading you that you're in their lobby. It's horrible. So to be, as it were, disloyal to your party, it feels awful. So if you're going to do it, you need to be really ready for the relational problems you're going to have afterwards. You need to be ready to cope with those and not allow them to escalate and become uncivil and unpleasant and impossible to repair. And you do really need to be clear why you're incurring all those penalties. So selection and maintenance of the aim is the thing. Just scattergun rebellion really is unforgivable. Party politics is necessary to have a coherent government programme, and to rebel at all is a very serious thing. But as I say, I mean, for me, I've rebelled a lot, but on 3 key issues. Maybe on HS2 as well, and maybe also on freedom to protest. But, they were not scattergun issues. They were all issues that are either related to the constituency or very much a narrow range. I was never a Heidi Allen. Heidi Allen seemed to rebel at the drop of a hat on anything.
Well, I remember Andrew Jenkins, I think, put a letter of confidence into 4 of the 5 prime ministers or something like that. I just wonder, Steve, as well, in terms of civility, you obviously had that run-in with Patrick McLaughlin that set the tone perhaps for your relationship with much of the subsequent whips who came through that office. What were the sort of bust-ups that you remember?
I don't think Patrick would say that I was uncivil. I was just very firm. And I did actually win.
I mean, on his end, don't worry.
Well, I mean, he wasn't really uncivil to me. He was very firm. I mean, he did blow up a bit, but he wasn't actually rude. I don't think he swore at me or anything. But I did win a Civility in Public Life Award jointly with Ken Clarke for the emollients of the speech I made as we left the EU, and that was honoured by that Politician of the Year in Civility in Public Life. So I've always sought to be honouring of my colleagues, even as we disagreed. So, but I do remember some blowing up. I remember a whip trying to whip me in the lobbies, and she did it in an arch way, like it was comical. And she kept on. I said, no, let's not have this, because I've made it clear which way I'm going to be voting and why, and let's not pretend this is a joke. But she had to keep going, and I'm afraid I bellowed at her. How dare you try and whip me in this way? I will not tolerate you badgering me like this. I've got a parade voice. I think I sort of silenced the lobby. So it's not my proudest moment, but I'm afraid she slightly earned it because she badgered me and kept going. And I'd been civil and clear. But I'm afraid I once saw a whip try to get into the government lobby, just at the moment that it was shut, the doors had been called. And I remember the doorkeeper wrestling him out the way, because those are the rules. You're not inside. You can't wrestle the doorkeepers to get in. But Mostly unpleasantness didn't happen to me. It happened to other people, and because I'm afraid I was firm enough in what I was going to do and why that people didn't try it on with me.
And just a final question, Steve. I mean, you obviously became a minister at the end of your time in government. Was your advice ever sought because you obviously knew the rebel mindset so well, in the sense of why people do things, how organisations work? Did, for instance, the Number 10 political operation or the Whip's office ever say, go on, Steve, what are the secret tips, etc., or try and feel you out that way?
Not quite in those terms, no, although if they had done, I would have helped them. But I would have given the same honest advice I'm giving now,
Sure.
which is that members of Parliament would like to influence public policy.
Yes.
So if you want to lead members of Parliament, what you have to give them is what they want, which is some influence, which is not unreasonable, and it's what the public would expect. But instead, successive ministers and prime ministers treat them as lobby fodder and wonder why it blows up. So I would always say, point one. The notable exception is when the Windsor Framework came through. The Windsor Framework was a really hard compromise. I didn't much like it. It was only just good enough for me. Only just. We desperately needed to get the executive back in Northern Ireland. I've written about what a hard compromise it is for unionists and Eurosceptics. But Number 10, Rishi personally, absolutely did turn to me to land that. And I've taken really big hits with my Eurosceptic friends. My closest friend won't speak to me anymore, a Northern Irish guy outside Parliament. And I miss him desperately. But I did what was right for Northern Ireland. But, I mean, of course, I did it really hard. I took the wheels off Boris's rebellion by saying he was in danger of being a pound shop Nigel Farage. Very carefully crafted psychological message. And that did, I can see from the division lists that some of his lieutenants voted for the Windsor Framework who might otherwise not have done. I definitely took the wheels off his rebellion. I took the wheels off Liz's rebellion, and most painfully of all, including some rows in WhatsApp groups, I basically shut down the ERG. And people have said to me it was not yours to shut down. Well, I've apologised to a couple of people for the way that I shut it down. It's not shut down, it still goes, but I mean, in terms of its effectiveness, I brought that to an end. And it is an institution bigger than any one person, but it was only ever as effective as it was for one reason. But you know, on that vote, I did take a decision that I would support the government and minimise the rebellion, and I did it with every technique that I had available to me, and it worked. So in that sense, in that moment, yes, Number 10 turned to me to land a very important policy, and I used everything I knew against my erstwhile colleagues, and some of them still have not forgiven me, so it's a hard life.
Really?
Oh, it was a hard thing to do. Bill wouldn't mind me saying, I saw him yesterday and we parted on great terms, but he did say to me, you know, we've had some highs and lows, and for the Eurosceptics, me landing the Windsor Framework as hard as I did was a very difficult thing for some of them to bear. But as hard as it is, and as unresolved as some aspects of the situation are, indeed Labour's made it worse, by aligning us to agri-food. I mean, for unionists, Northern Irish unionists, it's a good thing, and that's why they back it, because it reduces the difference between Northern Ireland and Great Britain. But it's unforgivable to align us to part of the EU's jurisdiction. But, yeah, I mean, for some of those colleagues, they understand why I did it. I did it because it was the best, in my own judgment, it was the best thing overall for the country. But some Northern Irish unionists absolutely will never forgive me.
And no regrets on any of the rebellions, either side of it?
I can't think of a rebellion that I regret, no. I mean, they were all I thought necessary. I mean, in particular, on the meaningful votes, I'm absolutely convinced that if we'd allowed Theresa May's deal to go through, the Tory party would have had the much vaunted Corn Laws style split, and crucially, we would have had that Corn Laws style split with Jeremy Corbyn leading the Labour Party and Nigel Farage running Brexit Party candidates everywhere saying this is a betrayal. And in those circumstances, I'm quite sure that Jeremy Corbyn and John McDonnell would have taken power, and then our country would have been ruined for the rest of our lives. And so I can't regret that, as painful as it was, and as much as I wish Theresa May hadn't been on the rough end of it, because that was very painful. We've buried the hatchet, but I wish that hadn't happened to her. I wish I hadn't been among those doing it to her. But if we hadn't done it, the communists would have taken power.
Food for thought for any Labour welfare rebels watching or listening. Thank you very much, Steve, and thank you for listening to Coffee House Shots.